Hines is proud to partner The Urbanist on Monocle Radio. Hines is a leading global real estate investment manager. Hines owns and operates $93 billion of assets across property types and on behalf of a diverse group of institutional and private wealth clients. Hines' ambition? Well, in the words of its chairman and CEO, Jeffrey Hines, to be the best real estate investor, manager and partner in the world. Find out how Hines is making that dream a reality. Head to hines.com now. Hines, a leader in real estate investing and management since 1957. Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Coming up, we're back in the US this week to uncover a few stories that have all the connections to one particular metropolis. This time, it's the Big Apple.
The affordability crisis in New York is pretty staggering, and part of the problem is that the city hasn't been building enough housing to keep up with the amount of people moving in, the amount of jobs that have been created.
From a new book exploring how the question of privatising two of the city's cooperative living facilities is dividing the opinions of their residents, to look at the question of traffic and how downtown gridlock has been affected by the introduction of a congestion charge. Plus, how the City of Yes plan is bringing more density to neighbourhoods across New York. That's all ahead in the next 30 minutes, right here on The Urbanist, with me, Andrew Tuck. First up today, we hear a tale of two of New York's affordable housing co-ops and their struggle with the concept of privatisation. In the recent book, Homes for Living, urban planner and oral historian Jonathan Tarleton brings the stories of two social housing co-ops in Brooklyn and Manhattan to life as the residents are faced with the decision of whether or not to privatise. Do they stick to the rules that have kept their homes affordable for decades? Or do they rethink the model for a personal profit, but in the process deny future generations the advantages the cooperative gave them? What is unpacked is a complex tapestry of arguments, both for and against privatisation, that are rooted in race and class and uncover what ownership means and what homes are for. And I'm happy to say that Jonathan joins me on the line now. Thank you so much for being here today. Well, let's start with a bit of a clarification, because the term co-op can mean a few different things. What is a co-op in the context of your new book and these building complexes that you've been profiling?
The co-ops at the core of this book are what are referred to as limited equity co-ops, meaning these are very large affordable housing co-ops that were built for middle-income folks. There's a resale restriction on the cooperator's share. So when someone buys into this co-op, they're entitled to an apartment that they live in and to participate in the governance of their buildings. When they want to leave, they, however, cannot sell that share for much more than, what they bought it for. They basically are given back their initial investment adjusted for inflation. So this is very distinct from what I call kind of a more traditional speculative co-op, which are also predominant in New York. These limited equity co-ops are certainly not the norm, where, like much other housing in the US, you can sell your home for whatever the quote-unquote market will bear.
And just tell me, because, for Europeans, even that sounds quite a world of regulation and control and a bit socialist almost in the way that they're run, which feels that it goes against the grain of New York and US society. How did these co-ops come about?
These co-ops that are at the heart of the book, they came out of a program colloquially called Mitchell-Lama, which was passed in the mid-50s in New York State. And there was actually a very broad political base for this. This was a time of a real dearth of supply of homes post-war in the US. And for that reason, also a tremendous rise in housing prices. So these homes were really developed to allow for middle-income families who were too rich for public housing, and they also couldn't afford homes that had no sort of income restrictions or were not subsidized in some way. So this program was actually a tremendous success. There were 140,000 some co-op and rental apartments built through this program that were intended to be permanently affordable in perpetuity. And the core tension in this book is the evolution of that idea and the possibility of quote unquote taking them private. That's somewhat of a misnomer. These are private entities. These cooperatives are owned wholly by their residents, but they do still receive a lot of public benefit in order to keep them affordable for folks. At that time, it was not outside the norm of the conversation in the US. Today, people look at this and they say, oh, you can buy a co-op unit in Manhattan for $45,000. That's unheard of. That just speaks to the very different housing market that we're in now and the level of housing crisis that the US is undergoing.
Well, you've used the story of two of these co-ops, St James's Towers and Southbridge Towers, to run a magnifying glass over the whole of the way that the property industry, housing, the stresses in housing are unfolding at this moment in the US, particularly in this instance in New York. What made you choose this way of telling the story and these two places?
Because these are somewhat outside the norm, you might think, if you want to talk about housing in the US, you should look at the norm. But I think there's something really unique to look at this model, which has been broadly successful, that is actually a tool for addressing housing crisis, and to see how that has played out in time. So we are actually in a moment in the US where a movement for more social housing is gaining steam. There's a lot of talk of community land trust, of these kinds of co-ops, of other decommodified forms of housing to address housing crisis. And I thought it was very important to look at the actual existing models that we had and to see how those had fared over the course of 50 or 60 years. And what comes out in these stories is that, of course, public investment and continued maintenance is needed for these to thrive. But one of the primary threats actually to these models are changing perceptions within the buildings among the owners of these buildings of what they are for. And the lure, essentially, of profit that could come with taking away, removing the resale restriction that has kept these affordable over time to allow for people to sell their apartments for, say, they may have bought it for $3,000 in New York City in the 1970s, a very different place than New York is today, and now they could sell it for $1 million. As I dug into these stories, it became very clear that the ways that the resident owners of these cooperators thought about what their homes were for was actually quite deeply aligned with how other people in the US think about housing. They think about it as a means of great wealth building, primarily through housing appreciation. They think about it as a tool, essentially a social safety net to take care of costs like elder care, healthcare costs in the US, and that those pressures all get brought into this frame of these privatization debates that St. James and Southbridge are undergoing.
You're an oral historian and you tell these stories. I believe you changed the names of nearly everybody to make them narrators rather than us focusing on them as too much as individuals. But what were the levers at play here? Because when you look at the book, there's a few things. It's about politics, for sure, internal politics in the building and ambition. Race plays a part. As you said, economics and ambition play a part. I'm sure that this is why the story also pulled you in. What were the tides and the currents that these people were trying to navigate when they tried to make these decisions?
Looking at these debates on its face, you might think that it's purely about money. But as you dig in to these folks and you have deep conversations with them, it's clear that, as for everyone, home is about much more than profit. It's about a place to live. It's about community. It's about a place to raise a family. And you mentioned race, which is a key important distinction between these co-ops. Southbridge is predominantly white co-op. St. James Tower is a predominantly black co-op, and you can't talk about housing in the US without talking about race. So one thread that I thought was particularly rich in how some of the folks argued for, say, privatization was among Black cooperators at St. James Towers. And they often made an argument, and a very good argument, that they were entitled to profit from this housing and almost as a form of reparations for being locked out of wealth building in the real estate market because of its embedded racism. And that's a very strong argument. There are also, their neighbors in the same building, also Black, who made the argument that, well, we must maintain this housing because it is actually insulating us from that racist real estate market. And many of those families actually bought into these co-ops because they could not otherwise buy homes on the private market because of their race. So that's a very key thread throughout the book. It also plays out at Southbridge, this predominantly white co-op, where some of the folks who were arguing for privatization did not want to be associated with quote unquote public housing. And that has a very particular connotation in the US. It's often seen as deeply associated with lower income Black folks. And so these middle income white people in Southbridge, they wanted to distance themselves from that association through privatization, and profit was the means to do that. So that's, just one example of sort of the deep elements within these debates. I should say one more element is that owning a home in the US has been held up as the pathway to true citizenship in this country, and, essentially from its founding, but certainly through a lot of emphasis on home ownership starting sort of the 1920s through the 1950s. And, there were multiple Black cooperators in St. James who saw this as the pinnacle, saw this as a way to be enfranchised, and that their inability to privatize or profit from their home was, in fact, a kind of, again, another form of procedural disenfranchisement.
Looking at the book today, I got the impression that you, in a way, you had empathy. You understood people's stories in the round, that you didn't jump to quick judgments about their decision to sell. And we won't give away the end of the story, whether to stick or switch. But tell me, when you looked at the co-ops and you began to see this history that started back, as you say, back in the 50s, did you see in the formation of co-ops any potential promise for the future still? Because you are looking at the shortage of housing, and this debate about the lack of public housing and affordable housing is evident, I think, in just about every European city as well. Did you see still within the co-op movement something that was to be admired?
Absolutely. In addition to being an oral historian or writer, I'm also an urban planner. I've worked in housing development. I care about this, from a policy side as well. And one of the reasons I wanted to dig into the model was because it has been very successful. And despite these fights, it is an enduring model. So I see a lot of potential there. I think, as you point out, I do have great empathy for the folks in the book with whom I disagree. I don't think privatization is a good thing. At the same time, I can very much see how they get there. For these arguments about how else will I achieve this dream that I have, that I've been told through much public policy and cultural messaging is the pinnacle of life in the US, or how am I going to take care of my family? I think there's a lot to learn from these stories. When we talk about housing, we often don't center on people enough. We often talk about units. These stories show the deep human dimensions of our housing policy debates and the need to focus on how people relate to that housing for long-term maintenance. So I think in some ways, this is a story about maintenance for me, not just about the physical maintenance of the building, which certainly drives affordability challenges, not just about financial maintenance, making sure, a building is properly capitalized so it can take care of those physical costs, but also a kind of social maintenance. So, one thing over time that I see happening in these co-ops is that, we stop talking about what they are actually created for. We stop making the argument that, oh, well, we create this to take care of one another, to ensure that people have sort of the infrastructure that they need to live their lives in these places and to be able to pursue other dreams than just owning a home. And that kind of continual narrative or public policy messaging around, what is social housing for, I think is another element of this that is very important takeaway. A lot of the public policy interventions around maintaining these homes was financial. It was purely financial. It was, we'll give you more subsidized financing to ensure that you're able to take care of those physical costs. But there wasn't so much of the story of this is why we need this housing. This is why middle income folks need to be able to remain in the city. And I think that's very important. And to your question, I still see a lot of promise in these models in the US and beyond. One, if the ability to privatize is abolished, it's not a decision that I think any cooperator should really have to make. It's a very difficult decision to make. And if these places are properly maintained, both physically, financially, and socially. And I should say, both of these co-ops are broadly regarded as wonderful places to live. And they're well managed. They sometimes have 3 generations of families living within them. And they're in high demand, in part because they are such a good deal and because they're such good places to live. And we need more places like that.
My thanks there to Jonathan Tarleton. One of the biggest recent changes facing New York motorists who frequent the streets of Manhattan is the introduction of a congestion charge, though the longevity of the scheme under a Trump presidency may be in doubt. But while it's currently still in place, can we tell if the charge is actually making a difference in New York's most backed-up streets? TomTom, who you may remember from the personal navigation space, has also run a traffic index for the past 14 years. The index allows them to observe trends and changes in how clogged up our cities are, as well as allowing them to monitor how global events such as the pandemic shut down traffic and how quickly it came back to the pre-pandemic levels. Well, I caught up with Andy Marchant, the Director of Product Marketing for TomTom, and I began by asking him how they use their devices to assemble this index.
So we have around about 600 million connected devices around the world.
600 million? That's
600 million, yeah.
Wow.
So when you use a device that's connected to our network, it shares with us a GPS position. It's completely anonymized. We don't know who it is. All we know is that there is a device traveling in a certain direction on a certain road. And we match that against algorithms and our database to predict what's going to happen. So if we see probes, as we call them, slowing down on roads at certain times, we can say that there's traffic incidents. We can then match that against other sources of information we receive, and we can see whether that is because of a broken down vehicle, planned maintenance on the road, etc. But these devices, these probes, help us improve the map, so our users are getting the freshest information, and helps us provide the traffic information that goes into a lot of our customers' devices, vehicles, etc.
Now, let's jump back to the index. So last year, London was the 5th slowest city in the world. Mm-hmm. For some people who do go around in a taxi or a car, that may seem like a piece of bad news. But maybe if you're sitting in City Hall and you're trying to get people out of their cars, that's good news. So just tell us, why is London hit at number 5?
I think for those that know London and those that have travelled through London, it's a busy city. It's a 24/7 city. There's always something happening. And the volume of vehicles that travel through London is huge. You know, people, even though the congestion zone was brought in a number of years ago, there's still a lot of people that drive within the city for different reasons. Some will be because, you know, they have to make deliveries, they have to commute because using the public transport isn't suitable for them for whatever reason. So London has always been a challenge with traffic, and I think the average speed we calculated was something like 9 miles per hour through London, which, if you've ever experienced it, is probably about right, especially on some of the main thoroughfares through the city. Why is it like that? I think there's a number of reasons, and I think this is not unique to London, by the way. I think there's a lot of cities have the same issue. You know, the city was developed and the layout of the city was built a long, long time ago, and in places like London, you know, there's some very historic buildings, historic roads that date back a long time. And whilst a lot of investment and improvement has gone in to making the roads better, there's some things that you cannot change. There's some of the physical layouts that cannot be changed. And obviously the volume of vehicles traveling today is considerably higher than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and even further back. You could also couple that with infrastructure. So think about things like traffic lights and traffic light systems. Making those optimized is really, really challenging. You know, you have different patterns of travel. So at different times of day, different days of the week, when weather conditions change, the traffic patterns often change. So the ability to have traffic controls like traffic lights in a dynamic situation is hugely valuable, but takes a lot of investment. So I think as those start to improve and you can start to adapt the signal timings with the volumes of traffic, things like that will help ease congestion zones and blockages in certain areas.
Yeah, I believe that it's a fact that if you had a horse back in Victorian times, you'd have got across the city quicker than in a car today. But just tell me, congestion is a different thing to speed, though, isn't it? Because you could be moving at 9 miles an hour because, that's the speed the cities devise the traffic systems to get you down to. But there might not be a huge amount of traffic around. But congestion is like backed up cars. So are you counting the quantity of cars or speed more?
We capture all the information and we show it in a couple of different ways. So because a lot of the cities that are covered in the report are on a metric system, we use kilometers as our base measurement. And what we did is we took the time it takes to cover 10 kilometers or 6 miles. And we use that as the comparison. So you can look city by city, how long it takes to cover that same distance. And that gives you a very quick and easy comparison to say, if you wanted to cover that distance in central London versus central Paris versus Los Angeles versus Sao Paulo, you can see side by side the type of impact on traffic. But we also give a congestion measurement as well. And this measurement is a percentage number. And this is the additional percentage in time that it would take you to cover a distance if there was no traffic versus having traffic. So a time when the roads were empty versus what happens generally on a daily basis. And that can range in a number of different ways. So, if you look at some cities, you may see that they're higher in the ranking, but they have a lower overall congestion number because congestion is always high in that city. So there is no kind of spikes in the congestion because it's always busy. Whereas other cities have huge congestion spikes because at certain times, things just grind to a halt because of the number of vehicles coming in and out during those peak commuter hours.
I want to ask you about New York, but quickly tell me, who wears the crown then? Who's the slowest city in the world?
So the slowest city this year was a city in Colombia called Barranquilla. After that, I think the next 3 cities in the line are all in India, and then you roll into London. So again, I think it gives an indication of what to expect in that city. And, some people will say, yes, but our city is much slower than this, much quicker than this. But, using data averaged out across the year, looking at different factors, those are the results that we've come up with.
We'll have to find out what's going on in Barranquilla. But tell me, with New York, they're hopefully, or not hopefully, they're going to have this congestion charge in place for the next few years. Mr. Trump says he's going to get rid of it, is anti-car owner. But whether they stick or get rid of it, do you think it would change congestion in the city?
It will, yeah. I think fundamentally it will change congestion in the city. We saw that in other locations where it's been implemented, and it definitely has an effect. I think, London is the one I know most. That definitely had an effect on congestion. But if you look at New York, if you look at the same period in 2024 to 2025, the average daily congestion dropped from around 23.5% down to just under 16% in 2025 for that same period. That was across the day. And if you take the evening peak, it went from 41% to just over 28%. So it is having an effect. It is reducing people's travel time. Whether that is there long term, I think you'll have to measure that on a much longer term basis.
And finally, just tell me, car usage in general, most cities seem to have something in play to try and curtail excessive use of cars. Do you see cities where you can see over time that the number of people jumping in their car is on the downward shift?
Again, location changes drastically. I think those cities that have good public transport infrastructure, I think there's definitely an alternative to engage people to look at alternative methods. I think what a lot of cities that have been successful do is look at ways of not necessarily penalizing drivers. So not saying, hey, if you want to drive, there's a cost. It's more looking at what are the alternatives? How do you encourage people to get out of their car and into other modes of transport? So whether that's making public transport more accessible, it's making parking outside the city cheaper perhaps, or it's making provision for alternative methods like, electric vehicles. Is there a way to say, maybe if we encourage more electric cars, whilst we're still going to have high volumes of traffic, maybe that improves the emissions, within the city. So I think there's lots of different things that a city can do rather than just seeing this as a taxation on drivers. But for sure, having some kind of way of discouraging drivers from driving the city definitely does reduce the volumes overall.
My thanks there to Andy Marchant, Director of Product Marketing at TomTom. Finally today, we assess a recent plan introduced by the New York Mayor, Eric Adams, to combat NIMBYism and bring more residential space to his city. The plan is called City of Yes and is essentially an update to the zoning rules which are preventing good density and more effective home building in New York. It seems like a step in the right direction for the city, but is it enough to make a real difference? Well, I'm joined now by Sarah Holder, a writer for City Lab in New York and the author of a recent piece outlining the City of Yes plans. Sarah, thanks for joining me. Let's start with this plan. Can you explain a bit more about what Mayor Adams is trying to achieve here?
The City of Yes is a rezoning plan that was approved late last year by the City Council, proposed by the mayor, advanced by the Department of Planning, to basically rezone the entire city a little bit to allow for more housing construction. It creates the ability to build without adding as much parking as developers used to. It allows homeowners to build small ADU units in their backyard in some areas of the city. It allows more offices to be converted into residential apartments, allows for more density near transit and in commercial districts. And the overall goal is to basically allow developers to build a little more housing all around the city.
When I read your report and when I saw what was happening in New York, it's striking that I think the same debate seems to be happening in so many different cities. Many of the things that you're talking about are happening here in London, happening in every city that we go to. There's this same fear that there's a lack of affordable housing and a bit of NIMBYism as well, stopping development happening, but also that the city councils are sometimes the brake wittingly or unwittingly on change. Is this the problem that New York faces, a lack of affordable housing in central areas?
The affordability crisis in New York is pretty staggering, and part of the problem is that the city hasn't been building enough housing to keep up with the amount of people moving in, the amount of jobs that have been created. Over the past decade, New York City created about 800,000 jobs, but only about 200,000 units of housing, according to the mayor. The city's vacancy rate is 1.4%, which is, I think, the lowest it's ever been. And the housing that does exist is not affordable for the vast majority of New Yorkers. So one of the ways to alleviate that pressure, to increase that supply, is to allow developers to build more housing, or at least that's what advocates and the city hopes.
Just tell me, first of all, this isn't just a plan, this is kind of in action. Change is already being driven by the mayor. You reported on a couple of interesting examples. Could you tell our listeners about the things that are already happening in New York?
The plan was in development over a long period of time. The city council approved it at the end of last year, made some modifications that limited its scope and added a little bit more restrictions back. But already we've spoken to a couple of developers who are planning to take advantage of the rezoning. I spoke with a developer who's planning something for the Bronx waterfront. It's a development called Fordham Landing South. And originally he was planning to build about 576 units of affordable housing in this big community center because of some restrictions and how big that building could be built. And then now under the City of Yes, he's planning to shrink the community center and build more affordable units. 350 more is sort of the maximum estimation. So that's like a huge amount more of affordable housing that he's allowed to build. And part of the reason is because one of the parameters that have been loosened under the City of Yes is that developers will have a little bit more density to play with if all of the units they're adding are affordable. So it's called a density bonus or a universal affordability preference. So essentially, if a builder wants to build bigger than they would be allowed to build otherwise, all they have to do is make sure all those extra units are actually affordable in specific areas of the city, and they'll be able to add several more units to their floor plans. So that's what that developer is doing. There's also a developer that my colleague spoke with who's working on converting an office building into residential, and the parameters around those office to residential conversions have been loosened as well. Before City of Yes, the developer would have had to tear down part of the building, sort of go through a complicated reconstruction project, and now under City of Yes, some of those parameters have been eased, and they're having a lot easier time pursuing that office to residential conversion. And as you might imagine, after the pandemic, there's lots of office buildings that are potentially primed to become residential, much needed residential housing. And so City of Yes, the aim is to make it a little bit easier to do those conversion projects, which can be super expensive and pretty complicated.
So as the zoning changes, for example, around parking, not needing to supply so many parking spaces, is this in tandem then? I wondered if this was the reason that there is a push to do more of this development around transit corridors and around transit stations.
Yeah, I mean, the parking minimums are so interesting. Like, since the 1950s in New York City, developers have had to add a certain number of parking spaces whenever they're building an apartment building in New York or any housing in New York. And for a lot of people, that's kind of confusing because New York City, you don't really need a car in a lot of areas of the city. You can take the subway. A lot of people don't have cars, but whenever builders create units of housing, there is a certain number of parking spaces they have to add as well. So City of Yes, originally, they wanted to eliminate all of the parking minimums across the city, which means that developers could still add parking and probably would to incentivize people to live in their buildings, but wouldn't have to add as many as they were required to previously. Under the approved plan, there are 3 tiers of parking minimums. So some areas of the city, parking minimums have been completely removed. Some areas, they've been alleviated a little bit. And then some areas of the city where people are more car dependent and are more resistant to that type of change, there are parking minimums preserved. All that is to say, building parking spaces is very expensive for developers. It can hinder projects being built. And in lots of areas of the city, advocates would argue they're not necessary. So City of Yes is supposed to sort of address that concern. And meanwhile, the City of Yes is also trying to stimulate housing near transit. So if you don't have a car, if you rely on transit to get to work, it makes a lot of sense to build more housing near those transit centers. And so City of Yes allows more building to happen within a certain radius of transit centers like subway stations. Like, if you've been to New York, you might have been to a subway station, walked down the street, seen sort of like a 1-story commercial strip. And in many areas of the city, that 1-story commercial strip has not been allowed to grow bigger. Now, under City of Yes, a lot of those commercial strips can now add 3 to 5 more units of residential housing. And that's the kind of gentle density that advocates and proponents of this legislation want to see and think might happen fastest. And again, that's supposed to allow for more housing to be built near transit to allow people to get around the city, get to work.
And just finally, tell me, these additional dwelling units, which is something that started in California, it's almost like building another mini house in your backyard if you have the space. Is there room to do that in New York?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. ADUs, accessory dwelling units, they're also sometimes called granny flats because, like, your mother-in-law or your kid's grandma can live in them in your backyard. When they were legalized in California, they set off this huge ADU building boom. But you can imagine, California has a lot more room for these kinds of units in the backyards of single-family homes than you might imagine New York City does. But New York City also has a lot of lower-density, single-family zoned neighborhoods. So places like Riverdale in the Bronx, there's these beautiful single-family homes with big backyards, perfect for a potential ADU. Staten Island has a lot of single-family homes where ADUs might spring up. So you're not going to see them necessarily in Manhattan. And there's also a lot of places in the city where they're still not allowed, whether that's because there's flood risks or there's historic zoning mandates. But you might see them in some of these areas like Riverdale and Staten Island, where there's a little bit more room and space for extra units, which could provide homeowners extra rental income or the ability to have a family member come stay on your lot.
Sarah Holder, thank you for joining us today on The Urbanist. And that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. You can follow us for new editions of the show every week. And you can subscribe to Monocle magazine for reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism too. Just visit monocle.com. The Urbanist is produced by Carlotta Ribello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.